What defines a family legacy when it's built entirely on someone else's dreams? For Rebecca Walsh, a 28-year-old server at Chicago's most exclusive steakhouse, that question would transform from philosophical curiosity into devastating reality. For Harrison Montgomery, a media mogul whose empire spanned 3 continents, it would become the earthquake that shattered his carefully constructed world. She was simply trying to survive another 14-hour shift, serving aged steaks to people whose monthly wine budget exceeded her annual salary. He was just another powerful man in an endless parade of them, accustomed to having the world bend to his will. But when Rebecca noticed the distinctive sapphire brooch pinned to his briefcase, a brooch identical to the one her dying mother clutched as her most precious possession, two family histories were about to collide in ways that would rewrite the very definition of justice. This isn't a tale of coincidence or chance encounters. This is the story of how a single piece of jewelry became the key that unlocked a vault of secrets buried for generations, and how sometimes the most devastating truths are hidden in plain sight. But one autumn evening at the Sterling Crown, a sapphire brooch would change everything. The Sterling Crown occupied the top 2 floors of Chicago's Millennium Tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering diners a view of Lake Michigan. The restaurant catered to the city's elite, politicians, CEOs, and old-money families. The atmosphere was refined, and the servers were expected to be professional and attentive. Rebecca Walsh had worked at the Sterling Crown for 3 years. At 28, she moved through the dining room with practiced grace, her blonde hair pulled back, her black dress professional despite being purchased second-hand. Every interaction was carefully calibrated to meet the expectations of wealthy clients. Tonight was busy. The autumn charity season was in full swing, and the restaurant buzzed with Chicago's power brokers. Rebecca's section included Table 7, a corner booth reserved for Harrison Montgomery, the media magnate whose newspaper empire had made him one of the most powerful men in America. Harrison Montgomery didn't need an introduction. His silver hair was styled, his charcoal suit well-tailored, and his blue eyes held the intelligence of a man who had built a media empire. At 52, he commanded attention with his presence. Rebecca approached his table with her standard greeting, but as she set down the leather-bound wine menu, her gaze fell on his briefcase resting beside his chair. Pinned to the leather was a brooch that made her breath catch in her throat. It was exquisite, an antique sapphire surrounded by filigree work in white gold. The design was Art Nouveau, featuring delicate patterns around the central stone. But what made Rebecca's heart race wasn't its beauty or value. It was its absolute familiarity. Her mother, Catherine Walsh, had owned an identical brooch her entire life. It sat in a place of honor on her bedside table at Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility where Catherine was slowly succumbing to early-onset Alzheimer's. Despite losing most of her memories, Catherine still clutched that brooch during her lucid moments, insisting it was proof of who we really are. "The sommelier will be right over," Rebecca managed, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Harrison barely glanced up from his phone. "I'll take the 2005 Bordeaux, the Chateau Margaux." "Excellent choice, sir." As Rebecca turned to leave, the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "That's a beautiful brooch on your briefcase." Harrison's fingers paused over his phone screen. When he looked up, his blue eyes were sharp and assessing. "It's been in my family for generations. Victorian-era craftsmanship." "My mother has one exactly like it," Rebecca said, immediately regretting the admission but unable to take it back. The temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. Harrison set down his phone with deliberate precision, his full attention now focused on Rebecca with laser-like intensity. "That's impossible," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undertone that made Rebecca's skin prickle. "This brooch was commissioned specifically for my great-great-grandmother, Vivian Montgomery, in 1895. It's completely unique. There has never been another." The casual dismissal stung, but it was the implication that followed that made Rebecca's cheeks burn with indignation. "Your mother is either mistaken about what she owns or—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, but his meaning was crystal clear. "She's not a thief," Rebecca said firmly, her professional composure cracking. Harrison's smile was cold and patronizing. "Then perhaps you could explain how she came to possess what could only be a family heirloom that never left Montgomery hands. Maybe your family's version of history isn't as accurate as you think it is." The words were out before Rebecca could stop them, and she immediately saw Harrison's expression harden into something genuinely dangerous. "Miss," he glanced at her name tag, "Walsh, I suggest you focus on serving wine and leave family. Genealogy to those who actually understand it." He pulled out his wallet and placed a $50 bill on the table, more than double what most customers left for an entire evening service. But somehow it felt like an insult rather than generosity. "For your time and colorful storytelling." Rebecca felt heat flood her face, but before she could respond, Harrison was gathering his things to leave. As he stood, the brooch caught the restaurant's ambient lighting, and for a moment it seemed to wink at her mockingly. "If your mother truly has such a brooch," Harrison said, pausing at the table's edge, "I'd be very interested to know how she acquired it. The Montgomery family takes theft of their property very seriously." With that devastating parting shot, he walked away, leaving Rebecca standing among the crystal and fine china, feeling as though she'd been struck by lightning. The drive to Sunset Manor took Rebecca through Chicago's less glamorous neighborhoods, past convenience stores with barred windows and apartment buildings that had seen better decades. The contrast with the Sterling Crown's opulence was jarring, but it was the world Rebecca knew best, one where every dollar was counted and luxury was a foreign concept. She found Catherine in the facility's common area, staring out at the small garden that was already showing signs of autumn's approach. At 58, Catherine looked far older than her years, the disease having stolen not just her memories, but the vitality that had once defined her. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature grey, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands rested in her lap with the careful stillness of someone who no longer trusted her own movements. "Mom!" Rebecca sat beside her, noting the slight improvement in Catherine's awareness today. The good days were becoming rarer. "Rebecca, sweetheart?" Catherine's smile was genuine but fragile. "How was work?" "Interesting. Mom, I need to ask you about something." "About the brooch." Catherine's expression immediately became guarded, a flicker of the fierce intelligence that the disease hadn't yet completely claimed. "What about it?" "Where did it come from?" "You've always said it belonged to your grandmother, but I met someone tonight who claims his family owns the only one like it." Catherine was silent for so long that Rebecca wondered if she'd forgotten the question. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "My grandmother's name was Isabella Rosetti. She came to America from Italy in 1894, when she was just 19. She was an artist, Rebecca, a jewelry designer of extraordinary talent." This was new information. Rebecca had heard fragments of family history over the years, but Catherine had always been vague about their ancestors. Isabella found work with several wealthy families in Chicago, creating custom pieces for their wives and daughters. But her most significant commission came from a woman named Vivian Montgomery. Rebecca's blood ran cold. "Montgomery?" Vivian commissioned Isabella to design a complete jewelry collection for her upcoming wedding. The centerpiece was to be a brooch, something that would become a family heirloom. Isabella poured her heart into that design, creating something that perfectly captured Vivian's personality and the Art Nouveau style that was just becoming popular. Catherine's eyes grew distant, lost in memories that were becoming increasingly precious as her disease progressed. But when Isabella delivered the finished pieces, Vivian's new husband refused to pay her. He claimed the work was substandard, that Isabella had tried to cheat them by using inferior stones. Isabella knew it was a lie. She had documentation of every purchase, every hour of work. But she was an immigrant, a woman, and they were one of Chicago's most powerful families. The story was heartbreakingly familiar. Another tale of the powerful crushing those who couldn't fight back. But Catherine wasn't finished. Harrison Montgomery, Vivian's husband, had Isabella arrested for theft. He claimed she had tried to sell him fake jewelry and keep the real pieces for herself. The case never went to trial because Isabella couldn't afford a lawyer, but the accusation destroyed her reputation. No wealthy family would hire her after that. Rebecca felt sick. What happened to her? She died in poverty 3 years later, but not before she managed to complete one final piece, a copy of the brooch she had created for Vivian, made with her own materials and her own time. She gave it to my grandmother, along with all her sketches and designs, making her promise to keep them safe. Catherine reached for Rebecca's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Isabella made my grandmother swear that someday, when the time was right, the truth would come out. The brooch isn't just jewelry, Rebecca. It's evidence, proof that our family created something beautiful, and that the Montgomerys built part of their reputation on a lie. Rebecca stared at her mother, seeing not just the victim of a cruel disease, but the keeper of a family secret that had been preserved across generations. Mom, the man I met tonight, his name was Harrison Montgomery. He's the great-great-grandson of the people who destroyed Isabella. Catherine's eyes sharpened with a clarity Rebecca hadn't seen in months. Then it's time, she whispered. It's time for the truth to come out. The next morning, Rebecca found herself standing outside the imposing glass tower that housed Montgomery Media Group's headquarters. The building rose 60 stories above downtown Chicago, its sleek facade reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. She felt impossibly small approaching its revolving doors, but Catherine's words echoed in her mind. It's time for the truth to come out. The security desk in the lobby was marble and mahogany, staffed by guards in expensive suits who looked more like Secret Service agents than building security. Rebecca approached with as much confidence as she could muster. I'm here to see Harrison Montgomery. The guard's expression was politely skeptical. Do you have an appointment? Tell him Rebecca Walsh needs to speak with him about the Montgomery family brooch. He'll understand. 5 minutes later, Rebecca found herself in an elevator ascending to the 58th floor. The ride felt endless, giving her too much time to question whether she was making a terrible mistake. But when the elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that looked like it belonged in a palace, she knew there was no turning back. Harrison Montgomery's office occupied the entire corner of the building, with windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago and Lake Michigan beyond. The man himself stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at his domain. Miss Walsh, he said without turning around, I must admit I didn't expect to see you again so soon. My mother told me about Isabella Rosetti. That got his attention. Harrison turned slowly, his blue eyes now showing something that might have been surprise. I'm not familiar with that name. She was the woman who designed your family's brooch, and who was destroyed when she tried to claim credit for her own work. Harrison walked to his desk, a massive piece of carved mahogany that probably cost more than Rebecca made in 2 years, and sat down. He steepled his fingers and studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent decades evaluating potential threats. That's quite a story, Miss Walsh. Do you have any proof to support these allegations? Rebecca opened the manila folder she'd brought with her. Inside were photocopies of Isabella Rosetti's original sketches, detailed drawings that showed the brooch in perfect detail down to the smallest filigree work. The sketches were signed and dated 1894, clearly predating the supposed commission. She also had Isabella's business correspondence, letters to suppliers ordering the specific sapphire and white gold that would be used in the brooch, receipts for materials, and most damning of all, a letter from Isabella to her sister describing her excitement about the important commission from the Montgomery family. Harrison examined each document with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to due diligence. His expression remained neutral, but Rebecca noticed his hands weren't quite steady as he handled Isabella's original sketches. Interesting, he said finally, but hardly conclusive. These could be forgeries, created decades later to support a false claim. They could be, Rebecca agreed, but they're not. And I think you know that. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. For a long moment, the only sound was the subtle hum of the building's climate control system. "What do you want, Miss Walsh?" The question was direct, but Rebecca heard the wariness beneath it. Harrison Montgomery was a man who understood that everything had a price, that everyone wanted something. "I want the truth acknowledged. I want Isabella Rosetti's name cleared and her contribution to your family's legacy recognized. And that's all?" Harrison's tone suggested he didn't believe her for a second. "That's all." Harrison stood and walked to one of the massive windows, hands clasped behind his back. "You realize what you're asking? My family has worn that brooch with pride for over a century. It's appeared in newspaper society pages, museum exhibitions, even coffee table books about American jewelry design. If what you're claiming is true, and I'm not admitting it is, acknowledging it would be complicated." Complicated for whom? For you? For your family's reputation? Or just complicated because it would mean admitting that part of your legacy was stolen from an immigrant woman who couldn't fight back? Harrison turned sharply, his blue eyes flashing with anger. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Miss Walsh. The Montgomery family didn't build an empire by backing down from baseless accusations made by what? By servers? By working-class people who don't know their place? By opportunists looking for a payday." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with shame and rage. "I'm not asking for money, Mr. Montgomery. I'm asking for something you apparently don't understand. Basic human decency." She gathered up her documents and stood to leave. "Keep the copies. Study them. Have your experts authenticate them. But when you do, remember that every time your family has worn that brooch, you've been celebrating the destruction of an innocent woman's life." Rebecca was halfway to the door when Harrison's voice stopped her. "The authentication will take time, and it will be thorough." She turned back to see something that might have been uncertainty in his expression. "If, and I emphasize if, these documents prove authentic, we'll discuss what form of acknowledgement might be appropriate." It wasn't an admission, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Rebecca nodded once and left, feeling as though she'd just lit a fuse whose explosion she couldn't predict or control. What she didn't know was that Harrison Montgomery's uncertainty wasn't about the authenticity of her documents. It was about how much of the truth he could afford to admit and what other family secrets might come to light if he started pulling at the threads of the past. The authentication process took 3 weeks, during which Rebecca continued working her shifts at the Sterling Crown. Her mind was constantly elsewhere, wondering what Harrison's experts were discovering. The call came on a Thursday afternoon as Rebecca was helping her mother with lunch at Sunset Manor. Catherine was having one of her good days, alert and present. "Miss Walsh, this is Harrison Montgomery. I need to see you tonight, my office, 7 o'clock. The line went dead before Rebecca could respond.
"What is it, sweetheart?"
Catherine asked, noting her daughter's expression. "I think we're about to find out if the truth matters more than money." Harrison's office was different at night. The panoramic windows that had seemed impressive during the day now revealed a glittering cityscape that made the space feel like a command center overlooking the world. Harrison stood at those windows again, but this time Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control that suggested a man barely keeping his emotions in check. "The documents are authentic," he said without turning around. "Every sketch, every letter, every receipt. My experts were extremely thorough." Rebecca's knees felt weak with relief and vindication. "So you acknowledge that Isabella Rosetti designed the brooch? I acknowledge that your ancestor created detailed sketches that predate the supposed commission date by several months. I acknowledge that she purchased materials consistent with the finished piece. And I acknowledge that her business correspondence supports her claim to have designed what became known as the Montgomery family brooch." It was the most qualified admission Rebecca had ever heard. But it was still an admission. "There's more," Harrison continued, finally turning to face her. "My authentication team didn't stop with your documents. They dug into our own family records, correspondence that hasn't been examined in decades." He walked to his desk and picked up a folder that was significantly thicker than the one Rebecca had brought him. "It seems my great-great-grandfather, Harrison Montgomery, the original, kept meticulous records of his business dealings, including documentation that paints a very different picture of what happened with Isabella Rosetti." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of documentation?" Harrison opened the folder and pulled out a series of yellowed letters. Correspondence between my ancestor and several other wealthy Chicago families, discussing what he called the Italian problem. It seems Isabella Rosetti wasn't the only immigrant artist whose work was appropriated. The word hung in the air with all its ugly implications. "My great-great-grandfather was part of a systematic effort to exploit immigrant craftspeople. They would commission work, refuse to pay, and then claim ownership of the designs. When the artists protested, they would be accused of theft or fraud. The wealthy families involved shared information about troublesome artists to ensure they couldn't find work elsewhere." Rebecca sank into one of the leather chairs facing Harrison's desk. "How many people did they destroy?" "According to these records, at least a dozen that we know of. Jewelry designers, silversmiths, furniture makers, all immigrants who had the misfortune to be talented enough to catch the attention of Chicago's elite." Harrison sat down across from her, looking older than he had just weeks before. "There's something else. Something that makes this personal in a way I hadn't expected." He pulled out a final document, a letter in spidery handwriting that Rebecca didn't recognize. "This is from my great-great-grandmother Vivian to her sister, written 3 months after Isabella Rosetti's death. In it, she expresses guilt about what happened and reveals that she had tried to pay Isabella for her work, but was overruled by her husband." Rebecca read the letter with growing amazement. Vivian Montgomery had not only acknowledged Isabella's talent, but had kept detailed records of all the artists her husband had wronged, apparently hoping that someday they could be compensated. "She never had the power to act on her conscience during her lifetime," Harrison said quietly, "but she preserved the evidence, as if she hoped that future generations might be better than hers." The weight of discovery settled over both of them. This wasn't just about one brooch anymore. It was about a pattern of exploitation that had enriched one of Chicago's most prominent families at the expense of countless innocent people. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across his desk. "That depends on what you consider justice, Miss Walsh." Rebecca thought of her mother, slowly losing herself to a disease that was stealing her memories one by one, but still clinging to a piece of jewelry that represented her family's stolen legacy. She thought of Isabella Rosetti, dying in poverty, while the people who had destroyed her wore her creation as a symbol of their own superiority. "I want the complete story told," she said firmly. "Not just about Isabella, but about all the artists your family wronged. They deserve to be remembered for their talent, not their victimization." Harrison nodded slowly. "It will destroy my family's reputation. Generations of carefully cultivated public image, gone." "Some reputations deserve to be destroyed, and some do," Harrison agreed quietly. "But there are other considerations. My media companies employ thousands of people. My family's charitable foundation supports hundreds of causes. If I admit to systematic fraud going back over a century, the legal and financial consequences could destroy everything, including the good work we do now." Rebecca saw the genuine conflict in his expression. This wasn't the calculating billionaire who had dismissed her at the Sterling Crown. This was a man grappling with the weight of inherited sin and trying to find a way to make amends without destroying everyone who depended on him. "What are you proposing?" Harrison pulled out his phone and showed her a news website design. I'm proposing we tell the story on our own terms. My media empire gives us the platform to ensure it's told completely and accurately. We establish a foundation dedicated to supporting immigrant artists and craftspeople, funded by a significant portion of my personal wealth. And we make sure that Isabella Rosetti and all the others are remembered not as victims, but as the talented creators they were. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more acknowledgement than Rebecca had ever hoped for. And the brooch? Harrison opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was the Montgomery family brooch, its sapphire catching the office lighting like a captured star. This belongs with Isabella's family. It always has. But as Rebecca reached for the box, Harrison's phone buzzed with an urgent message. His expression darkened as he read it. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "It seems we weren't the only ones who know about those documents." Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, the office door burst open without warning. A tall, elegant woman in her 50s strode in, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression coldly furious. Behind her came a man in an expensive suit whom Rebecca didn't recognize. "Aunt Vivian," Harrison said, rising from his chair, "I wasn't expecting you." Vivian Montgomery Hartwell, Harrison's father's sister and the family matriarch, fixed her nephew with a glare that could have frozen Lake Michigan. "Clearly. Otherwise, you might have consulted the family before deciding to destroy everything we've built." She turned her attention to Rebecca, looking her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "And you must be the little server who's been filling my nephew's head with fairy tales about stolen jewelry." Rebecca stood, feeling the familiar surge of anger that came whenever someone tried to dismiss her based on her job or social status. "I'm Rebecca Walsh, and I have documentation proving that your family built part of their reputation on stolen work." Vivian laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Documentation? My dear girl, you have some old papers that could mean anything. What you don't have is understanding of how the real world works." The man who had entered with her stepped forward. "Miss Walsh, I'm Richard Blackston, the Montgomery family attorney. I think you'll find that any claims against my clients are well beyond any statute of limitations. Moreover, attempting to extort money from the Montgomery family based on unsubstantiated allegations could result in serious legal consequences for you." Rebecca felt the familiar chill of being outmaneuvered by people with more money and power than she could ever hope to match. But then she looked at Harrison, seeing something in his expression that gave her courage. "I'm not trying to extort anyone," she said firmly. "I'm trying to get justice for my great-great-grandmother and all the other artists your family destroyed. Justice." Vivian's voice dripped with condescension. "Child, your ancestor was an immigrant who tried to cheat one of Chicago's most respected families. The fact that she created some sketches doesn't prove anything, except that she was planning her fraud well in advance." The rewriting of history was breathtaking in its audacity, but Rebecca had spent enough time around wealthy customers to recognize the technique. When facts didn't support your position, you simply changed the narrative. "That's not what the evidence shows," Harrison said quietly, and Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward him. "The evidence shows whatever interpretation serves our interests," Vivian snapped. "And right now, our interests require that this ridiculous claim be dismissed quickly and permanently." She turned back to Rebecca, her expression shifting to something that might have been maternal if it hadn't been so calculating. "Miss Walsh, I understand that caring for an ailing parent is expensive. Perhaps we could discuss a private settlement that would help with your mother's medical costs. Something generous enough to ensure that these unfortunate misunderstandings don't continue to cause problems for anyone." It was smoothly done, the offer of help disguised as generosity, but with the clear implication that refusal would bring consequences. Rebecca recognized it as the same tactic Harrison's ancestor had probably used with Isabella Rosetti and countless others. "I don't want your money," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Everyone wants money, dear. The only question is how much." Harrison stood, his voice cutting through the tension. That's enough, Vivian. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to make a decision that will cost this family everything we've worked to build, all for the sake of some misguided guilt over people who died before you were born. They died because of what our family did to them. They died because they were weak, Vivian shot back with stunning cruelty. They came to this country with nothing, and when they couldn't survive in a competitive environment, they looked for someone else to blame. We don't owe them anything, Harrison. We certainly don't owe their descendants anything. Rebecca watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about Isabella Rosetti or even the brooch. This was about two fundamentally different views of power and responsibility, playing out between family members who had inherited the same legacy but drawn completely different lessons from it. I've made my decision, Harrison said finally. The story will be published, the foundation will be established, and the families of the artists we wronged will receive both acknowledgement and compensation. Vivian's expression turned arctic. Then you've made a mistake that will cost you everything. Richard, please explain to my nephew the realities of his situation. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened his briefcase. Harrison, as you know, your position as head of Montgomery Media Group depends on board approval. Your Aunt Vivian controls 43% of the voting shares through the family trust. If she chooses to call a vote of no confidence, the implication was clear. Vivian had the power to remove Harrison from control of his own company. You wouldn't, Harrison said, but Rebecca could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I would do whatever is necessary to protect this family's interests. And right now, those interests require that this situation be resolved quietly and permanently. Vivian turned to Rebecca with a smile that never reached her eyes. Last chance, Miss Walsh. Take the settlement, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and everyone walks away happy. Continue with this crusade, and I promise you'll regret it. Rebecca looked around the luxurious office, at the city glittering below, at the three people whose wealth and power dwarfed anything she could ever hope to achieve. Every rational instinct told her to take the money and walk away. Her mother needed care, she needed security, and fighting people like this was a battle she couldn't win. But then she thought of Isabella Rosetti, dying in poverty while her beautiful creation adorned the woman who had destroyed her. She thought of all the other artists whose names had been erased from history. She thought of her mother, holding that brooch and insisting it was proof of who we really are. I'll see you in court, Rebecca said quietly. Vivian's mask of civility finally slipped completely. You stupid little girl. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I will destroy you. I will destroy your family. When I'm finished with you, you'll be begging to take whatever scraps I'm willing to throw you. Vivian, that's enough. Harrison's voice carried authority Rebecca hadn't heard before. No, it's not nearly enough. You want to play the hero, Harrison? Fine, but you'll do it without the family fortune, without the company, and without the protection that comes from bearing the Montgomery name. She stormed out, the lawyer following in her wake like a well-dressed vulture. The office door slammed behind them, leaving Harrison and Rebecca alone with the wreckage of a century-old secret that had finally exploded into the open. Harrison slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 52 years. I'm sorry you had to see that. Vivian has always been ruthless when it comes to protecting the family interests. Will she really try to remove you from the company? She'll certainly try. Whether she succeeds depends on how much influence she still has with the other board members. Rebecca felt a stab of guilt. I'm sorry. I never meant for you to lose everything because of this. Harrison looked up at her with something that might have been admiration. Miss Walsh, Rebecca, you just stood up to one of the most powerful women in Chicago and told her you'd rather fight than take her money. Don't apologize for having more integrity than my entire family combined. He stood and walked to the window again, hands clasped behind his back in what Rebecca was beginning to recognize as his thinking pose. Besides, Vivian made one crucial mistake. She assumed that I need the company more than I need to be able to look at myself in the mirror. Rebecca joined him at the window, looking out at the city lights that seemed to stretch to the horizon. "What happens now? Now we fight. And we make sure that when this is over, Isabella Rosetti gets the recognition she deserved over a century ago." Harrison turned to face her, and Rebecca saw a determination in his expression that reminded her of her mother's fierce protectiveness. "But I should warn you, when Vivian Montgomery Hartwell declares war, it's not a figure of speech. She has resources, connections, and a complete lack of scruples. Are you sure you're prepared for what's coming?" Rebecca thought of her mother, slowly disappearing into the fog of Alzheimer's, but still clinging to a piece of jewelry that represented her family's stolen legacy. She thought of Isabella Rosetti and all the other artists whose work had been appropriated and whose names had been erased. "I've been preparing for this my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." The war began before dawn. Rebecca woke to find her phone buzzing with dozens of missed calls and text messages. Her social media accounts were flooded with friend requests from people she'd never heard of, and her email inbox was overflowing with messages from reporters, lawyers, and complete strangers. The first call was from her supervisor at the Sterling Crown. "Rebecca, I'm sorry, but I have to let you go. Effective immediately." "What? Why?" "Look, I can't give you details, but we received some very serious allegations about your conduct. Something about harassment of customers and attempted extortion." "I'm sorry, but the restaurant can't take the risk." The line went dead, leaving Rebecca staring at her phone in disbelief. She quickly called Sunset Manor to check on her mother, only to be told that Catherine's visitor privileges had been temporarily suspended, pending investigation of serious allegations. By 10 in the morning, Rebecca understood the scope of Vivian Montgomery's retaliation. A story had appeared on a gossip website describing her as a troubled server with a history of targeting wealthy customers for harassment and extortion attempts. The story included her full name, her address, and even a photograph that must have been taken from her social media accounts. Her landlord called to inform her that concerns had been raised about her tenancy. Her car insurance company sent a cancellation notice citing new information about risk factors. Even her gym membership was mysteriously terminated. Vivian Montgomery wasn't just attacking her. She was systematically destroying every aspect of Rebecca's life. The knock on her apartment door came at noon. Rebecca opened it to find Harrison Montgomery standing in her hallway, looking harried and concerned. "Are you all right?" "Define all right," Rebecca said, stepping aside to let him in. "I've lost my job, I can't see my mother, and according to the internet, I'm either a gold digger or a mentally unstable person who should be avoided at all costs." Harrison surveyed her modest apartment, the second-hand furniture, the stack of medical bills on her kitchen table, the photograph of Catherine that was the only decoration on the walls. "Vivian doesn't do anything by half measures," he said grimly. "She's using every resource at her disposal to pressure you into backing down. Well, it's working. I can't fight her, Harrison. I don't have the money or the connections. She can destroy me without even working up a sweat." Harrison sat down on her couch, looking oddly out of place in the humble surroundings. "She's trying to destroy me, too. The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. She's convinced them that I'm suffering from some kind of breakdown that's making me act irrationally." Rebecca felt a stab of guilt. "This is all my fault." "No, it's not. This is the result of choices my family made over a century ago. I'm just the first Montgomery who's had to face the consequences." He pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. "But Vivian made one mistake. She got so focused on discrediting you that she forgot I have a media empire of my own." The article was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune's website, with Harrison's byline. The headline read, "The Montgomery Legacy, How My Family Built an Empire on Stolen Dreams." Rebecca read the first few paragraphs with growing amazement. Harrison had laid out the entire story: Isabella Rosetti's talent, the commission of the brooch, the systematic exploitation of immigrant artists, and his family's role in covering up the truth for over a century. He hadn't held back, naming names and including photographs of the original documents. "You published everything," she whispered. "Everything that matters. The story is already being picked up by national outlets. Vivian can try to destroy us individually, but she can't stop the truth from spreading." Rebecca's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. "Miss Walsh, this is Dr. Patricia Hendricks from Northwestern University's Art History Department. I just read Mr. Montgomery's article, and I believe I have information that might be helpful to your case." Within hours, Rebecca's apartment had become a command center. Dr. Hendricks arrived with graduate students and research materials. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and intense focus. "Isabella Rosetti has been a subject of my research for years," Dr. Hendricks explained, spreading documents across Rebecca's kitchen table. "She was one of the most talented jewelry designers of her era, but her work was systematically attributed to the wealthy families who commissioned it." A graduate student named David pulled out a laptop. "We've been documenting cases of artistic appropriation in late 19th century Chicago. The Montgomery family wasn't unique, but they were systematic about it." Dr. Hendricks nodded. "What made their approach particularly insidious was how they coordinated with other wealthy families to blacklist artists who complained." Harrison leaned forward. "How many families were involved?" "At least 8 prominent Chicago names. They formed a cartel that controlled access to the luxury market." Rebecca felt sick. "How many artists did they destroy?" "We've documented at least 30 cases, probably many more. Most victims were immigrants who couldn't afford lawyers." Dr. Hendricks pulled out a particular file. But Isabella Rosetti was different. She kept meticulous records, and she wasn't working alone. She had connections to other Italian artisans who were experiencing similar problems. They were organizing, planning to expose the whole system. What happened to them? They were systematically destroyed before they could act. Isabella's arrest for theft was just the beginning. Within 6 months, every Italian artisan who had been part of her network was either arrested on trumped-up charges, had their workshops mysteriously burned down, or simply disappeared from the city entirely. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just about one brooch or even one family. It was about a deliberate campaign to exploit and silence an entire community of talented artists. Harrison's phone buzzed with a text message. His expression darkened as he read it. "The board meeting has been moved up. Vivian is calling for an emergency session tonight. She wants me removed before this story gains any more traction." Dr. Hendricks looked up from her documents. "Mr. Montgomery, I hope you understand the historical significance of what you've done. This is the first time anyone with the resources and platform to be heard has been willing to acknowledge these crimes. If you're removed from your position now, the story will be buried again. Then we need to make sure that doesn't happen," Rebecca said firmly. That evening, the Montgomery Media Group boardroom was filled with tension. The room had mahogany paneling, leather chairs, and a conference table that could seat 20 people. At the head sat Vivian Montgomery Hartwell, every inch the family matriarch in her tailored suit and pearl necklace. Harrison entered with Rebecca beside him, a decision that immediately drew disapproving murmurs from several board members. Rebecca felt out of place in her best dress, but held her head high. "This is highly irregular," announced board member Charles Whitmore III, his voice carrying the entitled authority of old money. "Corporate governance meetings are not public forums. Miss Walsh is here as a witness," Harrison replied calmly. "Given that tonight's discussion centers on allegations about her character and motivations, I believe she has a right to face her accusers." Vivian's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "How dramatic, Harrison. But since you mention accusations, perhaps we should address the elephant in the room. You've published a story that not only destroys our family's reputation, but also makes unsubstantiated claims about several other prominent Chicago families. Do you understand the legal liability you've exposed this company to?" Richard Blackstone, the Montgomery family attorney, opened a thick folder. We've already received calls from the Ashford and Caldwell family legal teams. They're threatening defamation suits that could bankrupt the company. Harrison remained calm. Every fact in that story has been verified by independent experts. Dr. Patricia Hendricks from Northwestern University has spent years researching this period. The documents are authentic, the historical pattern is well documented, and the claims are supported by evidence. Evidence that conveniently supports the narrative of a young woman who approached you with demands for money, board member Margaret Ashford interjected. Rebecca realized with a chill that she was likely a descendant of one of the families named in Harrison's article. "I never asked for money," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the hostile stares directed at her. "Of course you didn't ask directly," Vivian replied with false sweetness. "You were much cleverer than that. You presented yourself as a crusader for justice, knowing that Harrison's guilt complex would make him an easy target." Harrison stood, his voice cutting through the room's murmur. "That's enough. Miss Walsh brought me evidence of crimes committed by our ancestors. Rather than investigating those crimes, you're attacking the messenger. We're protecting this company from a public relations disaster that could destroy everything our families built," Charles Whitmore replied coldly. "Everything our families built on stolen work," Harrison shot back. The room erupted in angry voices, board members shouting over each other. Through the chaos, Rebecca noticed something that made her blood run cold. Several board members were wearing jewelry that looked suspiciously familiar, pieces that matched designs in Isabella Rosetti's sketchbooks. When the shouting died down, Vivian called for order with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Enough. We're here to address Harrison's fitness to lead this company. His recent behavior demonstrates a complete lack of judgment and a willingness to destroy the interests of our shareholders for the sake of his personal crusade." She turned to face the assembled board members. "We call for a vote of no confidence in Harrison Montgomery as CEO and chairman of Montgomery Media Group." "Seconded," Charles Whitmore said immediately. Rebecca watched the faces around the table, seeing the calculation in their expressions. These weren't just business associates. They were members of the same social circle that had protected each other's interests for generations. Harrison stood again, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Before you vote, there's something else you should know." He pulled out his phone and connected it to the room's presentation system. The large screen at the end of the room displayed a document that made several board members visibly pale. "This is a letter from my great-great-grandmother Vivian to her sister, dated 1897. In it, she not only acknowledges that Isabella Rosetti designed the Montgomery family brooch, but also lists the names of artists wronged by 8 other Chicago families." Rebecca read the names on the screen, then looked around the table. Every major family represented on the board was mentioned in the letter. "She kept detailed records," Harrison continued, "because she hoped that someday the wrongs could be righted. She documented which artists were destroyed, which families were involved, and which pieces of family heritage were actually stolen work." The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret Ashford was staring at her grandmother's emerald necklace as if seeing it for the first time. Charles Whitmore had gone completely white. "You're all wearing stolen art," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying in the absolute silence. "Those aren't family heirlooms. They're evidence of a century-old conspiracy." Vivian tried to regain control. "This is ancient history. We can't be held responsible for continuing to profit from stolen work." Harrison interrupted. "For systematically covering up the truth for over a century. For destroying the reputations of anyone who tried to seek justice." He clicked to the next slide, which showed bank records and legal documents. "The cover-up didn't end with our ancestors. It's continued right up to the present day. Every time someone has tried to research the real origins of these pieces, they've encountered mysterious legal obstacles, missing records, and academic pressure to drop their investigations. Dr. Hendricks had given Harrison access to decades of research that showed the ongoing suppression of truth. Historians who had gotten too close to the story had found their funding cut, their access to archives mysteriously revoked, their careers quietly derailed. "You want to remove me for damaging the company's reputation?" Harrison asked. "Our reputation was built on a lie. I'm offering us a chance to build something real." Instead, he outlined his proposal, the establishment of a foundation that would not only compensate the families of wronged artists, but also work to identify and properly attribute stolen work across the country. The Montgomery Media Group would use its resources to investigate and expose similar historical injustices, becoming a leader in corporate accountability rather than a defender of inherited privilege. "It will cost us millions," Margaret Ashford said quietly. "It will cost us less than the lawsuits that will inevitably come if we continue to cover this up," Harrison replied. "More importantly, it will give us something we've never had: legitimacy." The board members looked around the table, seeing their fellow conspirators in a new light. The comfortable assumption that their family legacies were unassailable had been shattered. Charles Whitmore was the first to break. "If we vote to support Harrison's proposal, if we establish this foundation and acknowledge what our families did, can we put this behind us?" "We can try to make amends," Harrison said. "We can't undo the past, but we can stop perpetuating its injustices." The vote was closer than Rebecca had expected. Several board members recused themselves due to obvious conflicts of interest. In the end, Harrison's proposal passed by a single vote. Vivian Montgomery Hartwell was not gracious in defeat. She stood slowly, her face a mask of cold fury. "You've destroyed everything our family worked to build," she said to Harrison. "For what?" "For the sake of people who died before you were born. For the approval of a waitress who couldn't afford to eat at the restaurants where she worked." She turned to Rebecca, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you've won something here? You've destroyed one of Chicago's most important families for the sake of your petty revenge. I hope it was worth it." With that, she swept out of the boardroom, taking Richard Blackstone and 2 other board members with her. The room felt lighter without her presence, but Rebecca knew the war was far from over. Harrison collapsed into his chair, looking as though he'd aged a decade in the past few hours. "She'll fight this in court," he said quietly. "She has the resources to drag this out for years. Let her," Rebecca replied. "The truth is already out there. She can't put it back in the box." The aftermath moved faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, Harrison's story had been picked up by major newspapers across the country. Art historians and museum curators began examining their collections with new scrutiny. Several prominent families quietly reached out to Harrison's team, offering to participate in the foundation rather than face public exposure. The Montgomery legacy was being rewritten in real time, transformed from a story of inherited privilege into one of corporate accountability and historical justice. Rebecca found herself at the center of a media storm she hadn't anticipated. Interview requests poured in from television shows, podcasts, and documentary filmmakers. Publishers reached out about book deals. Lawyers offered to represent her in potential civil suits against the families who had slandered her. But the moment that mattered most came 3 weeks after the board meeting, when she was finally allowed to see her mother again. Catherine was having one of her good days, alert and present in a way that had become increasingly rare. She listened quietly as Rebecca told her about everything that had happened: the confrontation with Harrison, the discovery of the conspiracy, the board meeting, and the establishment of the foundation. When Rebecca finished, Catherine reached for the small wooden box on her bedside table. Inside, the sapphire brooch caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the nursing home window. "Your great-great-grandmother would be proud," Catherine said softly. Isabella never gave up hope that someday the truth would matter more than money. She pressed the brooch into Rebecca's hands. "This belongs to you now, not because it's valuable, but because you finished what she started." Rebecca looked down at the brooch, no longer just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of justice finally served. "What should I do with it?" Catherine smiled, and for a moment Rebecca saw the fierce intelligence that the disease hadn't yet claimed. Whatever you think is right, sweetheart. You've earned that choice. A month later, the Isabella Rosetti Foundation for Artists' Rights held its inaugural gala in the ballroom of Chicago's Palmer House Hotel. The event was attended by historians, artists, museum curators, and several of the board members who had voted to support Harrison's proposal. Rebecca stood at the podium, wearing a simple black dress and the sapphire brooch that had started everything. Behind her, a large screen displayed photographs of Isabella Rosetti's original designs, alongside the family heirlooms that had been created from them. Isabella Rosetti came to America with nothing but her talent and her dreams, Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. She was destroyed by people who saw her gifts as something to be taken rather than celebrated. But she never stopped believing that someday the truth would come to light. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Tonight, we establish a foundation that will ensure no artist suffers the fate that Isabella and so many others endured. We will protect creators' rights, expose historical injustices, and make sure that talent is celebrated rather than stolen. She looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that represented both the problem and the solution. Some were descendants of the families who had perpetrated these crimes, now working to make amends. Others were artists and historians who had spent years fighting for recognition and justice. The brooch I'm wearing tonight will be donated to the Chicago Art Institute, where it will be displayed not as a family heirloom, but as a testament to Isabella Rosetti's genius. Alongside it will be her original sketches, her business correspondence, and the story of how her work was stolen and her reputation destroyed. She paused, feeling the weight of history and the hope of redemption. But more importantly, the foundation will work to identify other cases of artistic appropriation, to restore recognition to forgotten creators, and to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The applause was thunderous, but Rebecca's attention was drawn to one figure near the back of the room. Harrison Montgomery stood quietly, no longer the untouchable billionaire she had first encountered, but a man who had chosen conscience over comfort. After the speeches, they found themselves together on the hotel's terrace, looking out over the lights of Chicago. "Any regrets?" Rebecca asked, echoing the question she had posed weeks earlier. Harrison considered it seriously. "I lost half my board of directors, my family won't speak to me, and my net worth dropped by about 60%. Rebecca winced. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I traded a fortune built on lies for a legacy built on truth. That's not a loss. That's the best deal I've ever made." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city sparkle below them. Somewhere in those lights, artists were creating without fear. Inventors were developing new ideas with confidence that their work would be protected, and families were finally able to tell their true stories. The sapphire brooch that had sparked everything was now safely in the Art Institute, displayed with a placard that read, "Designed by Isabella Rosetti, 1894, a testament to the talent that survives even when those who would steal it do not." Rebecca thought of her mother, sleeping peacefully at Sunset Manor with the knowledge that her family's honor had finally been restored. She thought of Isabella Rosetti, dead for over a century, but finally receiving the recognition she deserved. She thought of all the other artists whose stories were still waiting to be told. "What's next?" Harrison asked. Rebecca smiled, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose. "We keep fighting. We keep telling the truth. We make sure this never happens again." In the months that followed, the Isabella Rosetti Foundation became a model for corporate accountability and historical justice. Other companies began examining their own legacies, and several major museums launched initiatives to research the provenance of their collections more thoroughly. Vivian Montgomery Hartwell filed multiple lawsuits, all of which were either dismissed or settled out of court. She eventually retreated to her estate in the Hamptons, where she maintained her innocence to anyone who would listen. The Foundation's work expanded beyond Chicago, identifying cases of artistic appropriation across the country and around the world. Rebecca found herself traveling to museums, universities, and corporate headquarters, helping to establish protocols for recognizing and compensating the victims of historical theft. Catherine Walsh lived to see her granddaughter receive an honorary doctorate from Northwestern University for her work in arts advocacy. She died peacefully 6 months later, having witnessed the complete vindication of her family's long-held truth. At the funeral, Harrison delivered a eulogy that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. He spoke of Catherine's courage in preserving Isabella's story, her dignity in the face of dismissal and condescension, and her faith that justice would eventually prevail. "Catherine Walsh understood something that my family forgot," he said. "The truth isn't just about the past, it's about the future we choose to build." A year after the Foundation's establishment, Rebecca stood once again in the Chicago Art Institute, this time as a member of the board of directors. She was looking at a new exhibition, Hidden Hands, the Immigrant Artists Who Built American Luxury. The exhibition featured the work of dozens of artists like Isabella Rosetti, talented creators whose contributions had been systematically erased from history. Their stories were finally being told, their names finally being honored, their families finally receiving recognition for the genius that had been stolen from them. A young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve as they stood before Isabella's brooch. "Why did they steal her work, Mama?" The mother knelt down to her daughter's level. "Because they thought they could get away with it, sweetheart. Because they thought no one would ever care enough to find out the truth." "But someone did care," the little girl said, reading the placard. "This lady, Rebecca Walsh, she found out." Rebecca smiled, overhearing the conversation. That was the point, after all. Someone had cared. Someone had refused to accept that power could permanently bury truth. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Harrison. "New case in Boston. Family claims their heirloom jewelry was actually designed by a Polish immigrant in 1902. Documents look promising." "Interested?" Rebecca typed back quickly, "On my way," as she walked toward the museum's exit, past the display case that held Isabella Rosetti's brooch. Rebecca felt the familiar surge of purpose that had driven her since that first night at the Sterling Crown. There were more stories to uncover, more truths to tell, more artists to vindicate. The work was far from over. But then again, justice was never a destination. It was a journey, and every step forward mattered. Rebecca Walsh had learned that a single moment of courage could change everything. She had seen how one person's refusal to stay silent could topple an empire built on lies. Most importantly, she had discovered that the most powerful weapon against injustice wasn't money or connections or political influence. It was simply the stubborn, unstoppable insistence that the truth should matter more than comfort. And in a world where power often tried to silence the powerless, that insistence was nothing short of revolutionary. The sapphire brooch continued to sparkle in its display case, no longer a symbol of stolen legacy, but a beacon of hope for every artist who had ever been told their work wasn't valuable enough to protect. Isabella Rosetti's name was finally where it belonged, in the light for all the world to see. Sometimes the most important victories take more than a century to achieve, but they're worth the wait. If this story of courage, truth, and the power of one person to change the world moved you, remember that every family has stories waiting to be told. Every community has heroes whose contributions have been overlooked or appropriated. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to ask the right questions and refuse to accept easy answers. What stories from your own family or community deserve to be brought to light? What truths have been buried by time or convenience? The next time you see an injustice, remember Rebecca Walsh and Isabella Rosetti. Remember that speaking up for what's right is never wrong, even when it's difficult. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that truth, and justice can triumph over even the most entrenched lies. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay silent.